Welcome to this deep dive. We're going to be tackling a fascinating and kind of disturbing topic today, the Neo-Assyrian Empire and their, shall we say, interesting approach to population management.
Yeah, you could say that. When we think about empires, what usually springs to mind? It's conquest, right? Warfare, expanding territory. But the Assyrians, they took things a step further.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, they didn't just conquer land; they completely reshaped the demographics of their empire through a systematic policy of population transfer.
Hold on. Systematic.
Yep.
That sounds incredibly well, organized
Yeah.
for, a civilization that existed thousands of years ago.
It was. I mean, we're talking about the Neo-Assyrian Empire here,
Yeah.
which, started around 934 BCE, and they implemented this policy for nearly 250 years. And we aren't talking about, small-scale relocations. One scholar estimates that over 250 million people were moved during this period.
250 million people. That's more than twice the current population of the United States. I mean, it's hard to even fathom that kind of movement.
Yeah. I mean, the scale is just mind-boggling. And the impact was enormous. The Assyrians had a number of motives for uprooting entire communities. One key driver was control. Instead of executing rebels, they often chose to relocate them to distant corners of the empire.
Exile is a form of population control. I mean, it's clever, I guess,
Yeah.
but also pretty ruthless.
Oh, absolutely. It was a very effective way to neutralize threats and, expand their reach at the same time. But it wasn't just about quelling rebellions. The Assyrians also recognized the economic potential of resettlement. They needed skilled workers in newly conquered territories, and relocation provided a ready-made workforce.
That makes sense. I mean, jump-starting the local economies
Yeah.
and, helping to integrate new regions into the empire.
Right. Exactly. And there's another fascinating aspect to this. They also use relocation to spread knowledge and technology. Think of it as a very calculated form of cultural diffusion.
So by relocating, skilled farmers or artisans or even scholars, they ensured a certain level of consistency and expertise across this vast territory.
Exactly. I mean, you can almost think of it as a ancient precursor to standardized education or professional development programs.
Right. Spread the expertise, control the quality,
Right.
and, the output of goods and services.
Precisely. Now imagine you're on the receiving end of this policy, forced to leave your home, your community, everything you know.
Yeah. It must have been absolutely terrifying for many. But, I mean, were all experiences the same? Did everyone face the same level of hardship?
It's, the sources paint a very complex picture. Some accounts describe deportees traveling with their families and possessions, suggesting a level of organization and maybe even a degree of consideration. Others depict a much harsher reality, people shackled, separated from loved ones, forced to march under duress. It's a reminder that this was ultimately a forced migration with a whole spectrum of experiences.
Yeah. While some might have seen this relocation as an opportunity, for many it was undoubtedly a traumatic experience.
Absolutely. And this complexity also extends to how the Assyrians handled the relocated populations once they arrived at their new destinations. Instead of isolating them, they actually encouraged integration with the existing population.
That seems counterintuitive. I mean, wouldn't it be easier to control a population that's, segregated and marginalized?
Perhaps in the short term. But the Assyrians, they had a different goal in mind. They wanted to create a unified Assyrian identity, blur the lines between conquerors and conquered.
So it wasn't just about military might.
Mm-hmm.
It was about cultural assimilation as well.
Exactly. And they believed that by encouraging cultural exchange and even intermarriage, they could foster a sense of shared identity and loyalty to the empire.
It's really amazing how calculated their strategy was.
It really was. And this policy had a profound impact on the region, shaping its demographics and its culture for centuries to come. I mean, it's a real testament to the enduring power of population movements, even those enforced under duress.
And speaking of enduring power, it makes me think of the Assyrian captivity that's mentioned in the Old Testament. Wasn't that a result of this same resettlement policy?
You're absolutely right. The Israelites were relocated in multiple waves after rebelling against Assyrian rule. Imagine the impact of that upheaval on their culture, their religion, their entire history. It's a story of forced migration that continues to resonate thousands of years later.
It's fascinating how this seemingly ancient practice connects to events that are still relevant today.
Right. It really highlights how these large-scale population movements can have lasting consequences.
I mean, it makes you wonder about the ripples of these events and how they continue to shape the world we live in.
Exactly. And that's something we'll delve into a bit deeper when we come back for part two.
So we've talked about why the Assyrians moved all these people around.
Yeah.
And, the impact it had. But I'm curious about the logistics of it all. How do they actually manage to move millions of people across such vast distances? I mean, the planning, the resources required, it's just mind-boggling.
Well, you have to remember that the Assyrians were incredibly organized. I mean, they meticulously planned these relocations, taking into account everything from food supplies and transportation to security along the routes.
Wow.
It was a complex operation, especially when you consider, the lack of modern technology.
Yeah. I mean, our modern day struggles with, traffic jams and flight delays seem pretty trivial in comparison. We're talking about coordinating the movement of thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of people on foot.
With animals and carts.
Exactly. And we have to remember, these journeys often crossed hostile territories, posing, additional risks and challenges. The Assyrians' ability to manage these relocations, it really speaks volumes about their administrative and logistical capabilities.
So what can you tell me about, the experiences of the people being relocated? What do the sources say about that? I mean, were families kept together? What kind of conditions did they face during these journeys? Well, the sources offer a glimpse into a variety of experiences. Some accounts describe groups traveling with families and belongings, which suggests a level of order, maybe even a degree of humanity in the process. It's almost like picturing, this mass migration across the ancient world, with families carrying their few possessions, herding livestock, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy amidst all the upheaval.
That's a striking image. But I imagine not all experiences were that organized.
Right. Unfortunately, no. Other accounts depict a much harsher reality. We read about people shackled, separated from loved ones, forced to march under brutal conditions. And these accounts serve as a stark reminder that this was a forced migration, and for many, a deeply traumatic experience.
Yeah. It's easy to get caught up in the, strategic brilliance of it all. But we have to acknowledge the human cost. For every skilled worker who might have found opportunity in a new location, countless others endured unimaginable hardship.
And we also have to be mindful of potential biases in the historical record. I mean, we're largely reliant on Assyrian accounts, which naturally emphasize their own achievements and downplay the suffering of those they conquered.
Yeah. It's like reading a company's press release. You're only getting one side of the story.
Exactly. So we have to be very careful to critically evaluate the sources and acknowledge the limitations of our knowledge.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we've talked about the why, the how. Now I'm kind of curious about the who. Did the Assyrians target specific groups for relocation, or was it just, anyone who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time?
Yeah. Well, no, is much more strategic than that. They carefully selected groups for relocation, often based on their needs and goals. For example, if they needed to quell unrest in a particular region, they might target, the most rebellious elements, those deemed the biggest threat to their rule.
Remove the instigators and problem solved, at least from their perspective.
Right. But they also targeted specific skills and professions. If they needed to boost the economy of a newly conquered city, they might relocate entire communities of artisans, craftsmen, or farmers. Those whose skills were in high demand.
It's like an ancient form of headhunting, but on like a massive scale.
You could say that. It was a way to not only control the population, but also to, fine-tune the economic and social fabric of their empire.
So all these newcomers coming into these existing communities, I mean, what was the reaction like? How did the existing populations respond to this influx of new people?
That's a fascinating question, and one that the sources don't fully answer, but we can speculate that there was probably a range of reactions. Some might have welcomed the newcomers, seeing them as a source of new skills and knowledge, a way to enrich their community.
And others might have viewed them with suspicion, as competitors for resources and jobs.
Right. Exactly. And remember, these relocations often brought together people from diverse cultures, speaking different languages, worshiping different gods. So it's likely that these newly formed communities experienced tensions and conflicts as they adjusted to their new reality.
It's almost like a giant social experiment, albeit one conducted under duress.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder about the long-term, cultural impact of this forced mixing of populations.
Yeah, the impact was undoubtedly profound. I mean, the Assyrian Empire's resettlement policy played a major role in shaping the demographics and the cultural landscape of the ancient Near East. And the echoes of these ancient migrations can be seen in the languages, the religions, even the genetic makeup of modern populations in the region.
Wow. It's amazing to think that we're still living with the consequences of these events thousands of years later.
It highlights the enduring power of migration, even when enforced. But there's another layer to this story that we haven't touched on yet, and that's the role of religion.
Oh, right. The Assyrians were known for their pretty fervent religious beliefs. How did that factor into their resettlement policies?
Well, the Assyrians believed that their god Ashur had granted them dominion over the world, and they saw it as their divine mission to spread their culture and their religion. So their resettlement policy wasn't just about moving bodies, it was about moving minds as well.
Yeah.
They sought to transplant their beliefs and practices along with their people.
So in their minds, these relocations were like a form of religious outreach.
Exactly. They often relocated people to areas where their own gods were already worshipped, believing that this would ease the assimilation process, encourage the adoption of Assyrian beliefs, and they also built temples and shrines in these new communities, further reinforcing their religious
So
presence.
they were strategically creating little pockets of Assyria throughout their empire,
Yeah.
complete with their own gods and temples.
That's a great way to put it. It was a way to project their power and influence, not just militarily and economically, but spiritually as well.
This adds a whole new dimension to our understanding of this resettlement policy. It wasn't just about control and expansion, it was about shaping the religious landscape of their empire as well. But what about the people being relocated? I mean, did they just abandon their old beliefs and adopt the Assyrian gods? Or did they resist these efforts at religious conversion?
That's a question we'll explore in part 3. We'll delve deeper into the cultural and religious dynamics of the Assyrian resettlement policy and examine its long-term impact on the ancient Near East.
So we really dug into the specifics of the Assyrian resettlement policy, the hows and the whys. But this story, it kind of makes me think about, the bigger picture. How does this ancient practice fit in with the broader history of forced migration?
Well, forced relocation of populations, sadly, it's not unique to the Assyrians. It's a recurring theme throughout history, often tied to, conquest, empire building,
Hmm.
the pursuit of power.
So the Assyrians were, in a sense, early adopters of a tactic that would be employed again and again.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. I mean, their systematic approach was remarkable for its time, but those underlying motives, control, exploitation, cultural dominance, those are unfortunately all too common.
It's a pretty sobering thought. I mean, what other examples of forced migrations kind of echo this Assyrian model?
Oh, there are many, unfortunately. The Roman Empire, for instance, they used forced resettlement to control conquered territories
Hmm.
and provide labor for, their vast infrastructure projects.
Interesting. So the Romans, known for their own, impressive feats of engineering and organization, they were taking cues from the Assyrians.
In some ways, yes. But, let's not limit this discussion to just ancient empires. Think about the transatlantic slave trade. I mean, one of the most horrific chapters in human history. It was essentially a mass forced migration driven by economic greed and racial prejudice.
Yeah. Millions of Africans torn from their homes and families, shipped across the ocean under brutal conditions. The scale of the suffering is just unimaginable.
It really is. And even in more recent times, we see forced migrations driven by conflict, persecution, political upheaval. I mean, the displacement of Palestinians during the creation of Israel, the expulsion of Germans from Eastern Europe after World War II, the Rohingya crisis in Myanmar. These are just a few examples of how this tragic pattern continues.
It's heartbreaking to see how this practice has persisted across, centuries and cultures. It makes you
Yeah.
wonder if we as a species are somehow predisposed to repeat these mistakes.
It's a valid concern. But by studying history, understanding the patterns and motivations behind forced migration, we can hopefully work towards a future where it's no longer a tool of oppression.
So what lessons can we learn from, the Assyrian example? What insights can we apply to the modern world?
Well, one crucial takeaway is the importance of recognizing the human cost. We often hear statistics about displaced people, but it's easy to forget that each number represents an individual life, a family uprooted, a community fractured.
Yeah. It's easy to get lost in the numbers and forget about the individual stories of suffering and resilience.
Right. We also need to understand the long-term consequences of forced migration. It's not just a temporary disruption. It can have profound and lasting effects on demographics, culture, language, even genetics.
So the ripples of these events are felt long after the initial displacement.
Absolutely. And finally, we need to challenge the narratives that often justify forced migration. Throughout history, it's been rationalized as a necessary evil, a means to some greater end, whether it's empire building, economic development, national security.
But the cost is often far too high. I mean, the suffering inflicted, the cultures disrupted, the legacies of trauma and resentment. These consequences can't be ignored.
You're right. We need to find more humane and just ways to address conflict displacement, the movement of people across borders. We can't keep repeating the mistakes of the past.
Well, this has been a really thought-provoking deep dive. We've journeyed from, this specific case of the Assyrian Empire to a broader exploration of forced migration throughout history. And it's really a reminder that history isn't just a collection of facts and dates. It's a source of lessons, warnings, and hopefully inspiration to create a more just and compassionate future.
Well said. The Assyrian case study shows us that population movements can be used as tools of empire building, but also that they have profound consequences that ripple across time. It's a reminder that our choices, as individuals and as societies, have the power to shape the course of history.
And that's really the essence of what we do here on the Deep Dive. We take a deep look at a seemingly distant historical event, and we uncover its connections to the present, prompting reflection and hopefully encouraging a deeper understanding of the world we inhabit.
It's been a pleasure exploring this fascinating topic with you.
And you. To our listeners, we hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity and given you a new perspective on the enduring impact of forced migration. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep into this fascinating world of history.